The airport was bustling with its usual chaos. Travelers hurried past one another, dragging their luggage and checking screens for their flight gates. Among them, a black man moved quietly carrying a small carry-on bag and a backpack. He had a calm demeanor, eyes focused ahead, and seemed to glide through the crowd with a certain ease, completely unaware of the storm that was about to land around him. He approached the gate, scanning his ticket, and patiently waited in line, checking his phone as he did so. Families with children in tow shuffled past him. Business people with briefcases muttered under their breath, and travelers in a hurry bumped shoulders. Nothing seemed to bother him. He was used to the chaos of airports and the stress of travel. He didn't rush. He moved deliberately with purpose, but without any sign of arrogance or haste. When the boarding call came, he stepped forward in line, presenting his ticket with a polite nod to the attendant. The woman in front of him, a middle-aged white woman wearing a bright scarf and a large designer handbag, suddenly turned and glared at him. Her eyes narrowed, lips pressed tightly together, as if the sight of him standing behind her triggered a deep irritation she couldn't hide. He didn't notice her at first, still focused on his ticket and the boarding process, but the woman, clearly offended by his presence, muttered under her breath. She took a step closer to the attendant, raising her voice just enough for him to hear. "Excuse me, is this your idea of lining up properly?" she said, glancing pointedly at him. "I was here first. Why is he even here?" The man looked up slowly, meeting her gaze, calm and composed. "I'm standing in line with everyone else," he said softly, his voice steady but firm. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just a clear statement of fact. He did not try to provoke her or argue. He merely existed in the moment with quiet confidence. Her eyes widened slightly, surprised at his calm response. It was not what she expected. She had anticipated flustered excuses or nervous mumbling, the kind of behavior she assumed would come from someone like him, but he didn't react in the way she wanted. Instead, he simply smiled faintly and returned his attention to the boarding gate. The woman huffed loudly, crossing her arms, her body language screaming displeasure. She leaned closer to the flight attendant, speaking in an exaggerated, irritated tone. "This man doesn't belong here. He should know better. Can't you see he's trying to take advantage of everyone?" Passengers nearby began to notice. Some whispered to one another, uncomfortable with the scene. Others watched silently, curious but hesitant to intervene. The man stayed silent, letting the woman's words float around him like bubbles that could not touch him. His calmness only seemed to frustrate her more. The flight attendant, a young woman with kind eyes, stepped in gently. "Ma'am, sir is in line like everyone else. We can board as tickets are called." The woman waved her hand dismissively. "I don't care. I've been waiting and I will not let him jump ahead. I'm telling you, he's being inappropriate." The man finally raised his hand slightly, not in a gesture of surrender, but to politely ask for attention. "I am not trying to cause any trouble," he said. "I am here for the flight, same as you. Let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be." His tone was calm, almost soothing, yet firm. Passengers nearby couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself. There was no defensiveness, no panic, no hint of confrontation, just a composed man standing with dignity in the middle of an uncomfortable situation. The woman, however, was not satisfied. Her face reddened and she leaned in closer, speaking louder this time. "Do you think just because you're standing there you have the right to take my place? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've had enough of this." People around began to murmur, glancing from her to him. Some passengers frowned, feeling the tension rise. Others looked away, hoping not to get involved. The atmosphere in the boarding area shifted. What had been casual and routine became charged with discomfort. The man continued to stand quietly. His eyes swept the room, noticing the subtle reactions of others without judgment. He didn't retaliate or escalate. His calmness was magnetic, pulling the attention of those around him and causing some to reflect on the unfairness of the woman's behavior. Finally, the flight attendant spoke again, her voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and allow boarding to continue. Everyone has a ticket and everyone will be boarded in order." The woman shook her head vigorously, muttering under her breath, clearly not ready to accept defeat. She looked around, hoping to find an ally among the passengers, but most were keeping their distance, unsure how to react. The man, still composed, simply waited for the boarding process to continue, showing no sign of frustration or anger. As the line began to move, the woman stepped aside reluctantly, her eyes still fixed on him. She whispered something inaudible, but the intensity of her glare made it clear that she had not given up her resentment. He ignored it, focused instead on walking calmly toward the airplane door, ticket in hand. The walk down the jetway was uneventful for most passengers, but the tension lingered in the air. Whispers spread quietly among those nearby, some expressing admiration for his calmness, others still shocked at the audacity of the woman. The man kept his head high, moving steadily, neither hurried nor slowed by the scene. Once inside the plane, he chose a window seat toward the middle of the cabin. He placed his bags carefully, ensuring they were secure, and sat down. He opened a book, immersing himself in the words, his posture relaxed as if the world outside the window did not exist. Yet even in his calm there was a sense of quiet authority that did not go unnoticed. The woman, meanwhile, was seated a few rows away, still fuming. She muttered complaints to the flight attendant, drawing the attention of nearby passengers again. The man didn't look up. He didn't react. Instead, he focused on the pages of his book, exuding a sense of serenity that contrasted sharply with the chaos she created. As the plane began to taxi, some passengers discreetly glanced at him, whispering among themselves. "Who is he?" one asked quietly. He seemed so calm and confident, even with that woman acting like that. Others nodded, sensing there was something remarkable about his presence. It wasn't just that he had handled the confrontation without anger. There was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself, a sense that he had faced much bigger challenges in life and emerged with dignity and tact. The woman, on the other hand, continued her complaints intermittently, growing more frustrated as no one seemed to support her behavior. Her words bounced off the calm aura surrounding the man, leaving her increasingly flustered and isolated. The man occasionally glanced up, not at her but at the cabin, taking in the reactions of the passengers. There was no malice in his eyes, no hint of revenge. He simply observed, understanding human nature, knowing that people often reveal themselves in moments of stress and entitlement. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted subtly. The tension between the woman and the man remained, but other passengers began to recognize the absurdity of her actions. Some exchanged small smiles, appreciative of his patience and composure. Others simply shook their heads, silently judging her behavior. He returned to his book, fully absorbed now, as if nothing could disturb him. It was clear to anyone paying attention that he had an inner strength far beyond what most people could comprehend. The woman, exhausted by her own frustration, finally slumped into her seat, muttering under her breath, defeated yet still simmering with embarrassment. The man remained calm, serene and unbothered, a quiet force of dignity and resilience amidst the chaos. Passengers around him began to feel a mix of admiration and awe. His behavior was a silent lesson in patience, humility, and self-respect. As the hours passed, he continued to read, occasionally glancing out the window, fully present in the moment. The woman grew more subdued, aware that her attempts to humiliate him had failed. She stared blankly out the window, no longer drawing attention with her complaints. The man, meanwhile, had become an unspoken presence of authority and calm, quietly transforming the energy in the cabin. By the time the plane began its descent, whispers had started to circulate among the passengers. "He's incredible," one said. "I can't believe how calm he stayed." Another added, "There's something different about him, like he's someone important." The air was thick with curiosity and quiet admiration. The man remained unaware of the speculation around him, focused instead on the simple act of travel. Yet even in his apparent ordinariness, there was a sense that he carried a story far larger than anyone could guess. A story waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And that moment, though not yet arrived, would soon change the perception of everyone on the plane in ways they could never have anticipated. As the plane settled into its journey, the woman continued to fume quietly in her seat. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface, a mix of embarrassment and anger that she could not fully conceal. Every time she glanced at the man, she found herself clenching her fists or muttering something under her breath. He did not react, nor did he acknowledge her hostility. He simply sat, his posture relaxed, one hand holding the book and the other resting calmly on the armrest, completely unbothered by her aggression. Other passengers around them began to take notice. Some whispered softly to their neighbors, pointing out the stark contrast between the man's calm demeanor and the woman's irritation. few passengers exchanged nods or quiet smiles, appreciating the patience he displayed in the face of unprovoked humiliation. Even the flight attendants moving down the aisle seemed to cast subtle glances, recognizing the tension and the man's extraordinary ability to remain composed. The woman, sensing that her attempts to draw attention and gain sympathy were failing, grew increasingly restless. She shifted in her seat, fidgeting with her handbag, and occasionally shot sharp looks at him. Yet every time she tried to provoke a response, she was met with silence and poise. His serenity acted like a mirror, reflecting her own discomfort and making it more pronounced. Passengers who were seated nearby began to feel the weight of the situation. There was a shared awareness in the cabin that something was unfolding beyond ordinary travel discomfort. Some leaned slightly in their seats, curious to see how it would resolve. Others simply watched quietly, feeling admiration for the man's restraint and patience. He had turned a public humiliation into a display of dignity and composure. At one point, the woman raised her voice slightly, speaking directly to the man. "You think you can just sit there like nothing is happening? Do you even know what you're doing? People don't behave like this," she exclaimed, her tone sharp and defensive. The man looked up briefly, meeting her gaze with a calm, unwavering expression. "I am aware of what is happening," he said softly. "I am simply choosing to remain calm. There is no need for conflict when it can be avoided." His words were measured, almost gentle, yet carried an undeniable authority that made the woman pause. Her lips pressed together, and she looked away, muttering something under her breath. He returned his attention to his book, his face serene as if the entire confrontation was just a minor distraction. This only intensified her frustration. She could not understand how someone could remain so composed while being publicly humiliated. Passengers nearby began to take subtle actions. Some adjusted their positions to get a better view, while others whispered observations. "He's handling this with such patience," one said quietly. "I can't believe how calm he is." Another added, "It's almost like he's above it all. Like he's used to dealing with situations like this." The man's calmness had a ripple effect. Even those who were initially unsure of what to think started to feel a sense of admiration and respect. It was clear that he was not reacting out of anger or fear. He was reacting with a quiet confidence, a self-assurance that seemed to command the attention and respect of the cabin without a single word being shouted. Meanwhile, the woman's frustration grew. She leaned over slightly, lowering her voice, and muttered to the flight attendant, trying to enlist sympathy. "This man has no respect for anyone. I can't believe he thinks he can just sit there and act like nothing happened." The flight attendant, maintaining professionalism, nodded politely. "Sir is seated properly and following all rules, ma'am. Please try to remain calm." Her tone was firm but respectful, signaling that she would not entertain further complaints without cause. The woman huffed, clearly unsatisfied, and returned to her seat with a scowl. She crossed her arms tightly and continued to fidget, her movements betraying her inner tension. The man, however, remained steady, absorbing the atmosphere without reacting negatively. He seemed to understand that the best way to handle such situations was with patience and grace, rather than confrontation. As the flight continued, a few passengers began to take discreet notes of what was happening, or at least keep mental records. Some whispered quietly to each other, marveling at the contrast. "Look at how he doesn't even flinch," one said. "I've never seen someone handle humiliation like that." The man occasionally glanced around, not in annoyance but in observation. He noticed small details about the passengers, their reactions, and even the woman's increasingly frantic gestures. There was no judgment in his gaze, just awareness. His ability to remain composed in the midst of tension made him seem larger than life, even though he remained physically unassuming. At one point, the woman tried a different tactic. She leaned slightly toward him and whispered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You think just because you're calm you're better than me?" The man looked up briefly, meeting her eyes with the same calm expression. "I am not better than anyone," he said. "I simply believe that calmness is more powerful than anger." His words were simple, but carried a weight that seemed to momentarily halt her tirade. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, checking on passengers, but the tension between the woman and the man persisted. They exchanged a few quiet words, ensuring that both were settled, but it was clear that the true resolution of the conflict was beyond their control. The man's composure had diffused some of the immediate tension, but the woman's frustration still lingered, a quiet storm of unresolved anger. Other passengers began to reflect on the situation in subtle ways. Some realized how often they had seen similar scenarios unfold, where anger and frustration escalated unnecessarily. Others admired the man's ability to rise above provocation without letting it affect his sense of self-worth. The scene became more than a simple confrontation. It was a lesson in patience, dignity, and the power of remaining calm under pressure. Hours passed, and the plane hummed steadily through the sky. The woman's attempts at drawing attention gradually diminished. She slumped slightly in her seat, exhausted by her own efforts. The man, meanwhile, remained a quiet presence of authority, his calmness influencing the energy in the cabin. Passengers who had initially been tense or uncertain now felt a sense of relief and admiration. At one point, a small child sitting nearby pointed at the man and whispered to their parent, "Why is he not angry?" The parent smiled, whispering back, "Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones who stay calm when everyone else is upset." The child's eyes widened in understanding, a small but meaningful moment of reflection on the power of patience. The woman, aware that her attempts to provoke a reaction had failed, grew more subdued. Her complaints became less frequent, and she shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the way her behavior had been perceived by those around her. The man's presence had an unspoken influence, quietly shaping the atmosphere and changing the way people viewed conflict and dignity. As the flight neared its halfway point, a subtle change occurred. Passengers who had been quietly observing began to whisper to each other, sharing thoughts about the man's remarkable composure. "I wonder who he is," one said softly. "He handles everything like he's used to it, like he's faced much worse." The man, still immersed in his book, remained unaware of the quiet admiration spreading around him. He was not seeking recognition or praise. His actions were driven by a natural sense of self-respect and understanding of human behavior. Yet even without intention, he had become a center of attention, a symbol of dignity and patience. The woman, now realizing that her attempts to humiliate him had not succeeded, grew more reflective, though she did not openly acknowledge it. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze fixed on the window, her thoughts likely turning inward. The man had not attacked her, not retaliated, and not even expressed frustration. He had simply existed in the moment with poise, leaving her to confront her own behavior. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. Passengers were reading, watching movies, or sleeping, yet the presence of the man remained palpable. His calm demeanor, his quiet authority, and his refusal to engage in conflict had left a lasting impression on everyone within sight. As the hours passed, small gestures of acknowledgement began to appear. A passenger would nod slightly in his direction, a smile would be shared between strangers, and a few discreet whispers expressed admiration. The woman, still seated a few rows away, grew more subdued, her own energy spent, while the man remained serene, fully immersed in his world, yet subtly aware of the lives he had touched simply by being himself. It became clear that this was more than just a confrontation between two individuals. It was a lesson unfolding in real time, a display of patience, dignity, and the quiet power of self-control. The man had transformed a potentially humiliating moment into an example of strength and humanity, leaving a subtle but undeniable impact on everyone around him. As the plane continued its journey, the story of the confrontation quietly spread. Passengers whispered to each other, recounting the events and marveling at the man's composure. Some speculated about his life, his experiences, and the depth of his character. The cabin, once tense with conflict, had shifted to one of reflection and admiration, all because of the simple act of remaining calm and dignified in the face of provocation. The plane hummed steadily as it moved through the sky, a gentle vibration beneath the passengers' feet. The man remained in his seat, book open, fingers lightly holding the pages, eyes scanning each line with quiet concentration. The cabin, though busy, seemed to adjust around him. His presence had a subtle but undeniable influence, drawing the attention and respect of those nearby without a single word being raised. The woman, sitting a few rows away, continued to fidget in her seat, restless and unsettled. She had stopped openly confronting him, but her eyes occasionally darted toward him, filled with an unresolved mixture of irritation, confusion, and something else: curiosity. She did not understand why he remained so composed, why he did not retaliate, and why he seemed almost untouchable despite her earlier efforts to provoke him. The man, though calm, was aware of the energy around him. He had learned to read subtle signs, small gestures, and quiet reactions. He noticed passengers glancing his way, some whispering to each other, others simply observing with quiet fascination. There was no pride in his awareness, only understanding. He had seen similar moments before, when people reacted to the presence of someone who carried themselves with quiet strength. And he knew the power of staying grounded in such situations. A flight attendant passed by, checking on passengers and offering drinks. She gave him a polite nod, and he returned it with a faint, courteous smile. Though the interaction was brief, it was filled with a mutual acknowledgement of composure and respect. Others in the cabin caught glimpses of these small gestures, and quietly, the man's aura of calm authority began to spread further. The woman, unable to contain her curiosity, leaned slightly toward a nearby passenger and whispered, "Do you know who he is? He seems different." The passengers shook their heads softly, eyes following the man's composed movements. "I don't know," they said, voice low, "but he's handling everything so well. I can't imagine staying that calm if someone treated me like that." The woman's lips pressed together, frustrated that no one seemed to be on her side. She had expected people to notice her supposed ordeal, to sympathize with her, but instead they admired the very person she had tried to humiliate. She tried to redirect her energy, adjusting her scarf, shifting her bag, muttering quietly under her breath. But the more she struggled, the more her own frustration became apparent, even to strangers. Meanwhile, the man continued his reading, fully absorbed, yet aware of the subtle changes in the cabin's energy. He noticed that passengers were whispering, that some had even started to take quiet notes or record mental impressions of the encounter. He did not mind. His focus remained on his book, but he understood the ripple effect his calm demeanor had created. It was not intentional. It was simply the result of years of learning to navigate conflict without letting it define him. A few rows ahead, a group of young travelers whispered to each other, pointing subtly toward him. "Have you noticed how he never reacts?" one asked. "Even when she's being ridiculous, he doesn't lose control." Their curiosity and admiration spread quietly. Another passenger, a middle-aged man traveling for business, leaned back in his seat and shook his head slightly. "There's something about him," he murmured, "like he's seen it all before. He doesn't need to prove anything. His calm is louder than any words." The woman, feeling increasingly isolated, attempted another subtle act of provocation. She cleared her throat, exaggeratedly shuffled her papers, and let out a loud sigh, hoping he would glance up and react. But he did not. He remained fully engrossed in his book, fingers turning pages with the same steady rhythm as before, entirely undisturbed by her theatrics. Her frustration bubbled beneath the surface. She had always believed that confrontation and raised voices could manipulate situations. Yet here was a man who simply refused to engage on that level. It unsettled her deeply, forcing her to confront a reality she was unaccustomed to. Not everyone could be shaken by anger or humiliation. Passengers around them began to notice the subtle tension. A woman a few rows back whispered to her companion, "It's almost like he's untouchable. She's trying everything, but he doesn't even flinch." The companion nodded, eyes wide with quiet admiration. "It's incredible," they said. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that with such grace." The man occasionally looked up, not at the woman but at the cabin as a whole. He observed subtle details, the nervous hand of a young passenger, the quiet smiles exchanged, the whispered admiration of strangers. His awareness was quiet, almost invisible, yet it gave him an unspoken presence that influenced the energy of the plane. The woman, now desperate for some acknowledgement, leaned toward him again, lowering her voice. "Do you even care what people think?" She muttered, more to herself than to him, "Don't you feel embarrassed?" He looked up for a brief moment, meeting her gaze with a calm and measured expression. "Embarrassment comes from reacting to what others project," he said quietly. "I choose to remain steady and true to myself, rather than let anger or judgment control me." Her eyes widened slightly at the words. They were simple, yet carried a quiet power she could not counteract. She had tried to provoke him with words, gestures, and frustration, but each attempt only highlighted her own agitation and his composure. She looked away, realizing that her efforts had failed and that she was now the one under scrutiny. A few passengers whispered quietly, reflecting on his words. "That's so true," one said. "He's not reacting because he doesn't need to. He's stronger than everyone realizes." The man's quiet authority continued to resonate. His calmness had transformed the energy of the cabin. Where there was once tension and discomfort, there was now reflection, curiosity, and admiration. People who had initially been uneasy now felt a subtle shift in perspective, recognizing the power of patience and dignity over anger and humiliation. The woman, aware that she could no longer manipulate the situation, slumped slightly in her seat. Her energy, once sharp and confrontational, began to fade. She stared out the window, eyes fixed on the clouds below, her thoughts inward. The man remained focused on his book, a silent force of presence unconcerned with her diminishing attempts. Hours passed, and the plane continued steadily through the sky. The man's calm had a ripple effect, spreading quietly from passenger to passenger. Some nodded subtly in his direction. Others whispered their admiration, and a few even smiled quietly at the lesson unfolding before them. The cabin had shifted from tension to quiet reflection, largely because of the man's composed presence. At one point, the woman, exhausted by her own inner turmoil, let out a small sigh and muttered under her breath. She seemed to realize that her actions had not achieved their intended effect, and the realization weighed on her. Meanwhile, the man continued reading, completely absorbed in his book, yet aware of the subtle admiration around him. He did not seek recognition, but he had become an unintentional example of grace under pressure. Passengers began to speculate quietly among themselves. "Who is he?" one whispered. "He seems like someone important. You don't stay that calm unless you've faced much bigger challenges." Another added, "It's like he's lived through situations far tougher than this. That's why he can remain so composed." The woman, feeling increasingly irrelevant and frustrated, adjusted her seat and leaned back, her energy depleted. The man remained a quiet presence of strength and authority, his calmness a stark contrast to her agitation. His patience and dignity had not only neutralized the humiliation she tried to inflict, but had also shifted the focus of admiration toward him. As the plane approached the midpoint of its journey, a subtle change began to unfold. Passengers who had been quietly observing now felt a sense of connection to the man's example. His calm authority had inspired reflection on personal behavior, reactions, and the way they themselves handled tension and conflict. He had transformed a small moment of confrontation into a profound lesson in patience, dignity, and the power of self-control. The woman, now almost completely subdued, stared blankly out the window, her thoughts likely turning inward as she processed the experience. The man remained composed, absorbed in his reading, yet subtly aware of the influence his demeanor had created. He had become more than a passenger. He had become a quiet anchor in the cabin, a reminder of the strength found in calm, measured response. By the time the flight reached the halfway point, whispers of admiration continued to circulate. Passengers marveled at his ability to remain unaffected by the woman's provocations. Some speculated about his life, imagining experiences that had taught him such patience. Others simply felt gratitude for witnessing a moment of quiet dignity in the midst of everyday travel. The woman, now exhausted by her own failed attempts, slumped further in her seat. Her eyes reflected a mixture of frustration, realization, and perhaps a dawning understanding of the impact of her actions. The man continued reading, completely unperturbed yet fully aware of the energy he had influenced. He had not sought attention or admiration, yet both had arrived quietly, naturally, because of the strength of his composure. As the hours passed, the story of the encounter quietly unfolded in hushed tones and exchanged glances. Passengers who had initially felt tension now experienced curiosity and reflection. The man's calm demeanor had turned an uncomfortable confrontation into an example of quiet authority and dignity, leaving an impression that would linger long after the plane landed. The plane continued its steady flight, sunlight streaming through the windows and casting a warm glow across the cabin. The man remained seated, fingers turning the pages of his book with quiet precision, his face calm, almost serene. Passengers around him had begun to settle into a rhythm, some still observing him, others lost in their own thoughts, but all now aware of the quiet power emanating from him. The woman, still seated a few rows away, had grown subdued. Her earlier attempts to provoke had failed, and her energy now seemed spent. She stared out the window, her expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She couldn't understand how someone could remain so composed in the face of public humiliation, and it gnawed at her sense of control. She had expected chaos, tears, or anger, but none of those reactions had come. Instead, he simply existed with quiet dignity. As the plane cruised at altitude, a subtle shift began to take place. The man's phone buzzed gently, drawing his attention. He glanced at the screen, his expression changing slightly, not in alarm but in focus. He answered the call quietly, speaking in measured tones. Though passengers could not hear the conversation, the shift in his posture was noticeable. He straightened, sitting taller, his quiet authority becoming more pronounced. The woman, sensing a change in his demeanor, stole a glance. There was something different now, a subtle intensity that had not been there before. His calm had always been impressive, but now it carried an undeniable weight, a presence that seemed to command attention even without words. Passengers around began to notice as well. A few leaned slightly, exchanging curious glances. There was a growing sense that this man was more than an ordinary passenger. Something in the way he carried himself suggested experience, competence, and a quiet authority that could not be taught. The flight attendants, too, seemed to sense the change. Their steps were more deliberate, their eyes briefly meeting his in acknowledgement. They maintained professionalism, but the subtle nods and respectful glances did not go unnoticed by passengers. Even the woman's agitation seemed to waver, her eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. As the plane continued, the man concluded his phone call and placed his device carefully in his pocket. He returned to his book for a moment, but the change in his energy lingered. Passengers whispered softly to each other. "He's someone important," one said. "There's no doubt about it now. You can just feel it." Another added, "He's handled everything perfectly, and now there's something else about him, like he's in control of everything around him." The woman, hearing the whispers, grew increasingly self-conscious. Her earlier attempts to assert authority and humiliate him had failed spectacularly, and now the subtle acknowledgement from others only amplified her embarrassment. She shifted in her seat, fidgeting with her handbag, muttering quietly under her breath. Suddenly, there was a quiet commotion near the front of the cabin. A passenger recognized the man and called over a flight attendant. "Excuse me," they said softly, trying not to draw too much attention. "Do you know who that man is?" The attendant glanced toward him and then returned their gaze to the passenger with a polite smile. "I believe he is a highly respected figure," she said quietly. "It seems the passenger has been recognized, but please remain calm. We want to maintain order on the flight." The whispers began to grow. Passengers who had not been paying close attention now focused on him, curiosity mixed with awe. The quiet admiration that had begun to spread was now becoming a palpable energy, a collective realization that the man was someone extraordinary. The woman, sensing the shift, could feel the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. She had tried to humiliate him, to assert superiority, but instead she had exposed herself to the judgment and subtle scrutiny of the cabin. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and she looked down, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Meanwhile, the man remained composed, as if unaware of the growing recognition around him. He had not sought attention or recognition. He had simply acted with integrity and patience, and now the world was beginning to notice. His calm and dignity had transformed the energy in the cabin, turning humiliation into admiration. As the plane continued, he received another discreet message on his phone. He read it, nodded slightly, and placed the device back into his pocket. His calmness remained unbroken, but there was an unmistakable shift in his energy, an aura of quiet authority that drew the eyes of passengers like a magnet. A young woman sitting nearby whispered to her friend, "He's more than just calm. You can tell he's someone who has done amazing things in his life. There's a presence about him that can't be faked." The friend nodded, eyes wide. "It's true. You can feel it. He's not just composed. He's someone who has earned that composure. I think he could change the world if he wanted to." The woman who had initially confronted him felt the full weight of her own ignorance. She had assumed she could provoke him and assert dominance, but the reality was entirely different. He had remained unshaken, and now passengers around were beginning to realize his true stature. Her attempts to control the situation had backfired completely, leaving her isolated and humiliated in a quiet, undeniable way. The man, noticing the growing awareness in the cabin, finally spoke to a nearby flight attendant in a calm, firm voice. Please ensure that everything is in order for the landing. There will be no disruptions and all passengers should remain seated and comfortable. The flight attendant nodded, a subtle look of respect passing between them. Passengers who overheard the instruction recognized the authority in his voice. It was not demanding or arrogant, but firm and assured. There was a sense that he could manage any situation with competence and calm. Whispers continued to circulate among passengers. I think he's a CEO or a government official, one speculated. Maybe someone in the military even. Look at the way he commands respect without saying much. Another added, he's clearly someone who has faced real challenges in life. You can see it in his calmness. The woman, realizing that her humiliation was now complete, sat quietly, staring at her hands. She had attempted to assert authority and create chaos, but she had failed spectacularly. The man had turned the situation around without anger, without confrontation, simply by existing with dignity and composure. As the plane began its descent, the man prepared for landing with quiet precision. He organized his belongings calmly, ensuring everything was in order while maintaining an air of composure that seemed to reassure those around him. Passengers observed with a mix of admiration and awe, understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The woman, now fully aware of the extent of her failure, remained silent. Her eyes avoided the man and her energy seemed depleted. She had tried to humiliate someone who carried himself with such quiet authority that the attempt had only highlighted her own pettiness. The man, unaware of her internal struggle, focused on the practical aspects of travel, ensuring that he was ready for landing. Yet the aura of quiet authority around him continued to resonate. Passengers whispered softly to each other, recounting what they had witnessed and marveling at his composure and dignity. As the plane touched down smoothly, the man stood, collected his belongings, and prepared to leave. Passengers near him subtly shifted, making space, giving him a respectful nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the presence they had observed. The woman, still seated, watched as he moved through the cabin with grace, finally realizing that the man she had attempted to humiliate was not only unshakable but also held a position or presence that commanded respect naturally. The cabin buzzed quietly with whispers and exchanged glances as he approached the exit. Flight attendants moved politely aside, allowing him to pass, their respect evident. Passengers observed, some recording mental notes, others simply reflecting on what they had witnessed. A display of patience, composure, and quiet authority that left an indelible mark. As he exited the plane, the woman finally understood. She had confronted someone she assumed she could belittle, someone she thought could be intimidated, but in reality, she had encountered a man whose quiet strength, patience, and dignity had not only neutralized her attempts, but had revealed his true identity in the most subtle and profound way possible. The realization was humbling, even painful, leaving her to reflect on her own behavior and the lesson she had inadvertently learned. The plane had landed smoothly, and passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted completely from the earlier tension. Where there had been frustration, whispers, and uneasy glances, there was now a quiet sense of reflection and admiration. People were discussing the man in hushed tones, amazed by how he had handled the situation with calm dignity. The woman who had earlier tried to humiliate him sat quietly in her seat. She stared down at her hands, feeling the weight of her failed attempts. She could feel the gazes of other passengers, not judging her cruelly, but reflecting the clear contrast between her agitation and his composure. Each passing second reinforced the lesson she had unintentionally learned about humility, patience, and respect. The man moved gracefully through the cabin, collecting his belongings with precision. He offered polite nods and small smiles to passengers and flight attendants alike. Each interaction was brief but carried a subtle warmth and acknowledgement that left those who observed feeling valued, not intimidated. It became clear that his influence was not rooted in authority or dominance, but in presence, patience, and integrity. Some passengers whispered softly, recounting what they had seen. "I've never seen someone stay that calm under pressure," one said. He didn't have to do anything. His calmness alone changed the energy of the cabin. Another added, "It's like he's lived through bigger challenges than this and knows that anger never solves anything." The woman felt a pang of embarrassment as she overheard these remarks. She had attempted to draw attention and assert superiority, but she realized now that her actions had only highlighted her own lack of composure. It was a humbling moment, one that forced her to reflect deeply on her behavior and how she approached conflict. Meanwhile, the man reached the exit of the plane, pausing to ensure that no passengers were struggling with their bags or needing assistance. His attention to detail and consideration for others did not go unnoticed. Passengers watched as he moved with quiet confidence and purpose, a man whose presence carried both humility and undeniable strength. A child sitting nearby tugged at their parent's sleeve and whispered, "Look at him. He's so calm. I want to be like that when someone is mean to me." The parent smiled and nodded, acknowledging the lesson the child had just witnessed. The child's eyes followed him until he left the plane, carrying with him a subtle but lasting impression of composure, patience, and integrity. The woman finally stood, gathering her belongings with a quiet grace that was new to her. She avoided looking directly at him, but her mind was busy processing the encounter. She understood that she had misjudged the situation and the man's character. Her earlier aggression seemed almost naive now, a reflection of insecurity and lack of experience in handling difficult interactions with dignity. Outside the plane, the man walked steadily toward the terminal, his presence commanding respect without the need for words or demonstration. Passengers watching him depart could feel the residual impact of his composure. Some whispered among themselves, sharing admiration, while others simply stood in quiet reflection, thinking about the lesson they had just observed. The woman remained seated briefly, taking a deep breath. She realized that humiliation was not a tool for superiority, and that true strength lay in patience, empathy, and self-control. She felt a sense of humility and awareness she had not anticipated, a deep recognition of the power of calm authority in the face of provocation. Inside the terminal, passengers continued to discuss the events. "He's incredible," one remarked. "He didn't fight back, didn't get angry, and yet he completely changed the dynamic of the cabin. That's real strength." Another passenger nodded. "It's rare to see someone handle conflict like that. We all have things to learn from him." The woman, now moving through the terminal, overheard the conversation. She felt a mixture of embarrassment and awe. Her mind turned inward, contemplating how she had allowed her own impatience and ego to guide her behavior. She resolved quietly to approach future interactions with more patience and understanding, inspired by the man's example. Meanwhile, the man exited the airport, moving with the same calm and purposeful demeanor. He carried no arrogance, no sense of superiority, only a quiet confidence that drew respect naturally. Passengers who saw him leave could not help but reflect on the subtle lessons he had imparted, without a single boast or confrontation. As the day continued, passengers who had witnessed the encounter shared their experiences with friends and family. The story of the man who remained calm in the face of humiliation spread quietly but powerfully, a testament to the strength found in patience, dignity, and self-respect. The woman, walking through the terminal, thought about the man's composure and the reactions of those around him. She felt a renewed sense of self-awareness and an understanding of the impact one person can have through quiet strength rather than aggression. It was a lesson she would carry with her for a long time, shaping how she approached future conflicts and interactions. Back in her own home days later, she reflected on the incident repeatedly. Each memory brought a deeper understanding of humility and composure. She realized that trying to assert power through humiliation only reflected poorly on herself, while genuine strength came from patience, empathy, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The man's example had quietly transformed the atmosphere around him, and it had left an indelible mark on those who witnessed it. Passengers who had observed him, whether in person or through stories afterward, carried the lesson forward, sharing it in conversations, reflecting on it in their own lives, and using it as a guide for handling their own moments of tension and conflict. In time, the woman understood that the experience was not just about a confrontation on a plane, but about human behavior, respect, and the power of dignity. She thought about how often people respond to anger with anger, and how much more powerful it was to respond with patience, calm, and integrity. The lesson had been delivered quietly without theatrics, but it was undeniable and lasting. The man, now going about his life, likely never knew the full extent of the influence he had left on those passengers. Yet the echoes of his composure spread quietly through conversations, reflections, and personal growth. He had turned a moment of potential humiliation into a powerful example of human dignity, patience, and self-respect. The woman, having fully processed the experience, began to make small changes in her own behavior. She approached interactions with more thoughtfulness, listened more carefully, and practiced patience in situations that might previously have triggered frustration. She had learned a lesson that could not be taught through words alone. It had to be witnessed, felt, and internalized. Passengers who had experienced the flight together remembered it as more than just a journey from one place to another. They remembered the lesson of the man who remained calm, who carried dignity in the face of provocation, and who inspired those around him to reflect on their own behavior. His quiet influence became a story shared for years, a reminder of the power of patience, humility, and human decency. In the end, what had begun as a tense confrontation ended as a transformative experience. The woman who had tried to humiliate him had learned a profound lesson. The passengers had witnessed an inspiring example of dignity, and the man had quietly demonstrated the power of composure, empathy, and self-respect. It was a reminder that true strength is not loud or aggressive, but calm, patient, and grounded in humanity. As life continued for all involved, the echoes of that flight remained. The woman carried newfound awareness and humility. Passengers reflected on the subtle lessons of patience and dignity, and the man continued his life with the quiet strength that had quietly transformed a cabin full of strangers. The encounter would not be forgotten, not for its drama, but for the human lessons it delivered through calmness, integrity, and the quiet power of presence.